We are proceeding, do not worry. Now, what I want to say when it comes to the war in the air, that I am not going to dazzle you with technical brilliance. I accept that some people need to fly, and I accept that I cannot swim to visit my dead soldiers in France and Belgium. But I always have to hold on to the hand of the person next to me, even if they're a total stranger. And it's no wonder that I get a lot of empty seats on each side of me. But I have discovered that the way to make an aeroplane fly safely is for me to take at least 2 very strong Lexatan, because it helps the pilot take off and land safely. So I just want to make it clear that I have certain deficiencies. Okay. So today what I'm going to do is give you a very brief overview of the issues which involved the war in the air. It is interesting. It was a great development. Artillery and radio and the Air Force were great developments in the First World War. And as we have seen in the last couple of years, drone strikes in Iraq, drone strikes in Afghanistan, the bombing of Aleppo, that's how war is conducted nowadays. After this brief look, we're going to look at 2 cousins. They both trained in England, they both flew in France, and they were very literate, and they both wrote quite a lot, on the one hand about training and on the other hand about bombing. And because their fathers had worked very closely with Cecil John Rhodes, every time they breathed, local newspapers thought this was very newsworthy, and that's how I managed to find in the Freiburg Northern News their letters published in 1917. Now, the concept of flight in times of war, whether it's for reconnaissance or whether it's for fighting, has been conceived over 100 years before the First World War. Should we turn the lights off? Would it be better? Yeah. And this is a painting of the Battle of Peru, which I have not researched, in 1794. Okay? So it was, balloons were being used. Oh, lights up there, please. Can you do those? You all want to sit in the dark. What are you planning to do in the dark? Okay. And it was in December 1903 that the Wright brothers piloted the first powered aeroplane. And those of you who were little nerds when you were children will know that they remained in the air for 12 seconds and they flew 120 feet. And that wouldn't get us very far nowadays. But by 1912, there was a royal warrant establishing the Royal Flying Corps. And I find the next picture rather interesting. It is totally anachronistic. This is a review by General Smith Dorrien in 1913, and you can see, I mean, look at them, in their plumes, in their, decorations, on horseback, reviewing an aeroplane in flight. And it gives you an idea, the year before the war, this was the attitude of the military towards aerial warfare and what became very important. Now, when war was declared, the Royal Flying Corps had 179 aeroplanes, but only 40 were capable of crossing the channel. And of course, they had to fly across the channel to participate in the war. One squadron was composed of observation balloons, but I don't know how many balloons. Now, there were a lot of skeptics over the use of aircraft in warfare. But by the end of 1914, when the stalemate in the trenches got started, the use of great artillery and this increased firepower made it clear that the cavalry was not going to be as important as it had been in the past. Firstly, it couldn't provide the reconnaissance needed. It couldn't get up to the artillery, and it couldn't get back quickly enough to send messages. Basically, riders couldn't ride far enough, and they couldn't ride fast enough, and horses couldn't run fast enough to do what was needed for artillery reconnaissance. And then by the end of 1914, with the stalemate in the trenches, aircraft reconnaissance assumed much greater importance. As you can see, if you've got an aeroplane that can show you, well, here's the front line, and look, here's their communications trench, and then on this side, they've only got one support trench and one reserve trench, but here they've got many, well, that'll be where we might do our little attack. Okay, so you need that kind of reconnaissance. How did they perform the reconnaissance? Well, here is a camera, and they would use this kind of camera to build up a mosaic map. Plates developed back at camp, and they would take them. Here, the camera is in a safety box, and you can see the cord that is pulled when you want to take the photograph for the reconnaissance. And here an observer in an aeroplane is demonstrating it. So, as we can see, it's attached to the side. He's the observer, he's not flying the plane, and he's showing you how it can be pulled. I mean, it's all quite developmental and Heath Robinson-y. And isn't it amazing to think that 100 years later, you know, people just use their phones all the time, and Kodak is sort of out of business. You know, what comes goes very quickly. Now, what did they take photographs on? They took photographs of trenches, as I've shown, of artillery bombardment. It was very important to know where guns were, because if you knew where the gun was, then you could tell your own guns to shoot the other side's guns. So artillery spotting was very important and organized both by balloons and planes. Now, how did they get the messages back? Well, in the beginning, they would fly back home and tell the sad news or the happy news. But they were equipped with transmitters. And this is called a complete wireless set, which is capable of sending messages. So you can see we've got batteries and we've got a little Morse code key. Okay? And this is what one looks like. It's in the Museum of Technology. And there is the Morse code key. Okay? And this would enable, giving the information, it would enable the artillery guns of your side to then aim, fire on the other side. Now, here's a battle actually taking place. You've got the trenches and you've got the artillery bombing, but you won't see them, but there are some poor little people following the artillery barrage. And the patrol work of aeroplanes performing their reconnaissance, they followed the course of battle so that they could also communicate with the infantry and say to the infantry commanders, your men are going left instead of going right, or vice versa. Now, as the war progressed, aircraft could carry heavier loads. They weren't now just photographing, they'd also become weapons of aggression. Now, have a look at this dear little pilot. Just have a look. He's dressed like a pilot, so he's got his goggles, which he isn't wearing. He's got a little furry hat. But actually, if you look, he's got his epaulettes and a very ordinary jacket, and he doesn't seem to be wearing anything around his throat, so he must be getting quite cold, and you can see his watch, and he's probably not wearing any gloves. There's no fancy clothes for this little bomber, okay? But here he is, and he's probably the observer bombing, and the pilot will be in front taking the photograph of him. Okay, so now we've become an aggressive force. Okay, now just to give you an example of aggression and civilians. In the opening weeks of the war, Zeppelin bombs a number of cities in England, and from 1915 they actually began quite an aggressive bombing campaign in England. In 1915, there were 19 raids over England. 1916, there were 23 airship raids. And overall, 557 people were killed in England in these raids. And it, I suppose, you know, is a precursor to the bombing of the East End of London and various other places, but you can understand why people felt very strongly about the dreadful Hun. Now, the same bombing obviously did not happen in Germany, for the obvious reason it was too far for everybody to go. So from England to Germany it's hard, but that is why France and Belgium have always been important in wars as between England and anybody else, because if the Germans can get to the coast, they are then very close to England. So their territory is safe, and they bombed England. Now, these Gotta G bombers, which I mentioned yesterday, were the first to be used for strategic bombing. 28 of these bombers were actually lost in England. And this, as I showed you yesterday, these are the kinds of bombs that they used. But, you know, the real efficacy of the bombing raids over England was actually that England and the Royal Flying Corps needed to defend themselves. So they diverted aeroplanes, they diverted Air Force aviators, mechanics, a whole lot of people to defend the home front, and therefore they were not on the other side of the channel in aggression against the German army. But as time goes on, we now have fighter aircraft. We've had reconnaissance aircraft, we've developed bombers, and now we've got fighter aircraft. And these are a schematic selection of British, French, German, and American fighter planes. And at the time, obviously, the RFC and the German flyers had to know the different kind of planes. And I'll just mention, the top right is a Sopwith Camel. On the left here is a Newport. The bottom left is an Albatross. There's an Albatross, okay, which will feature later. And then you might wonder why there is a swastika. And I thought to myself, no, this is later. Well, actually, this plane is a Spad. And it was flown by Captain Raoul Lufbery, and he was an American, and he flew it in 1917. So these are the kinds of planes. Now, the other thing that is interesting is look how everybody decorates their planes. We all know that Baron von Richthofen drove, if that's the right word, a red aeroplane. But you can see all the decorations, okay? And that's how they are able to identify who is flying what. So here is Baron von Richthofen's all-red Fokker plane. Unfortunately, there isn't a coloured photograph. And those of you who read Biggles as a child will be interested to know that James Biggleworth flew a Bristol aeroplane, okay? So now we've got the reconnaissance planes, the bombers, and we're now getting into fighters. So a fighter has got to be able to fight other aeroplanes. Machine guns on the front of planes. And this led to enormous changes in the design of aeroplanes. Now, this is a Camel. There's the cockpit, okay? And there are two machine guns. And you can see that they're in the front of the plane, but they are not directly in line with the flight of the plane. So the pilot is going to have to aim through the machine guns, and he's going to be firing over his plane. Now, if you have a two-seater aircraft, then you do something like this. You have your pilot there, and do you see he's got a machine gun? And do not ask me how this works, but the observer stands facing backwards, okay? And he fires over the wings. Okay, and presumably these planes aren't going very fast, and that's why you can see acrobatics sometime on these planes. Now, this did two things, because the first one, this is now an offensive plane. It is an offensive fighter. This plane is both offensive firing that way, but it is also defensive, because the observer can look in every direction. Okay, and you can see he's wearing a leather jacket. And recently when I was in Belgium, somebody was putting up an exhibition, and I tried on the leather jacket with hood. Well, I didn't fit into the leather coat, but I did fit into the hood, and I must tell you, you couldn't have lasted in it, I don't think, very long. Now, this is a model of a two-seater aeroplane, and it so happens that for our purposes, we are interested in this kind of plane. It's a Strata, a Sopwith Strata. And what it's got is we've got a Vickers machine gun in the front and a Lewis machine gun in the back. And do you see how it can go around this ring? Which means that the observer has 180 degrees at the back. So as you are weaving in and out in the sky, pilot fires forward and flies the plane, and the other one is being both defensive and offensive. Okay? Now, this was all, it took time, but they were working on this because it was incredibly important. But there was a problem. Do you see how you were always firing above the top of your plane? You are not aiming directly. You are not firing through your plane. And the big thing was to try and fire not with your two machine guns here, but to start firing through. So that by aiming the plane, you were aiming your machine gun. There was a problem. It was an enormous problem that the British solved very, very late and the Germans very early. It was called synchronization. And if I can just show you, your propeller is going round and round and round. The problem is, if the bullets go through, very quickly they're going to cut your propeller in half and you're going to end up on the ground. So they had to develop synchronization where it's like this. The bullets only go through when the propeller is in that direction. Okay? And this is what they worked on for a very, very long time. Now, it was a man called Fokker who developed the first aircraft with successful synchronization gear. And so the machine gun, you can see there is no machine gun, is firing through here. Now, this was very, very scarish for the British. It scandalized the British Parliament. There was much discussion about who has let us down and the wicked Hun, and of course German morale went up enormously. The British did not solve synchronization for a while, but they did develop new British fighters, such as this one. The guns remained at the front, look, but they were quick and they were fast planes, and actually these are the planes the British used in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. But we today are in 1917. And in the first half of 1917, it was an incredibly successful period for the German, and forgive my German accent, the Jagdstaffeln, which are the hunting groups. Okay? And it was the RFC, which was a much larger air force, which suffered much higher casualties than their opponents. The Allies now had the Sopwith Pup, the Sopwith triplane, but here you've got a Jasta. Now, a Jasta is a hunting group. You can see they use the cross. They've decorated their plane. They actually still have a gun on the top, okay? And look, they are dressed rather grandly as pilots, okay? And the Germans were now replacing their other planes with the Albatros, which I mentioned earlier. The Albatros D series of fighters were armed with twin synchronized Spandau machine guns. So you don't see a machine gun on the front, but they've got two machine guns made by Spandau in the gun. And you will see why I'm stressing Spandaus and Sopwiths in due course. Now, bombers and reconnaissance two-seaters were a bit slow and vulnerable, but as I've said, they've got the advantage of the gun at the front and the gun going round and round. Okay? Typically, the pilot would control guns behind the propellers and the observers controlled the one at the back. And then it became very complicated because if you were attacking a fighter, you would come up from behind and so on and so on. But I'm not going to go into those details. Now, all this is very marvelous, and I know that you're all going to enroll for flying lessons tomorrow, and I have a large supply of Lexotan for any of those who need it. And marvelous as these technological developments are, we take them very much for granted. But I want to look, as I said, at the very articulate lives of the two cousins. Clive House, who was a second lieutenant with 70 Squadron, and his cousin Stanley. Clive wrote about his training. Stanley wrote about dropping bombs. And what they wrote probably tells us more about the development of the Royal Flying Corps than anything else. Now, Clive was the son of Walter and Letitia House, and this is their family Bible, and they've actually put the deaths in first. So here we have Clive, okay, and then his father, and then his sister, and then his mother. And why I'm interested in this is because the entire family went off to war. Nobody remained in South Africa. But they started off on a vast farm, an estate called Carnarvon Estate, round about here north of Queenstown in Sturkstrom. Okay? They farmed with Walter, the father, farmed with his brother Edward, and it has now been bought recently by the government because it has so much water and so much mountains that it actually supplies water to Sturkstrom, Maltina, and Queenstown. They had mining interests in the region, and because of the mines, they got their own railway and their own railway siding, which is called Houston, after the House family. Both brothers, Walter and Edward, worked very closely in a number of business activities with people such as Cecil John Rhodes. And Cecil John was very impressed with Walter's building of dams on the Carnarvon estate. And you'll see here a newspaper story about how Mr. Edward House was in town buying up the material required in the construction of the big dam, which Mr. Rhodes is building on his estate, Sourdale, a few miles to the northeast of Bulawayo. Messrs. House brothers, who have had extensive experience on their own farm of dam making, have been entrusted with the contract, which must be finished by the end of the year. The scheme is to block up a narrow point by building an earthen wall, 375 feet wide at the bottom, 75 feet high, which will impound an immense quantity of water. If energy, hard work, and the capacity for making other people do their share of work will attain success, then Messrs. House brothers will succeed. And Mr. Edward House will have personal charge of the work and will reside on the spot. It actually wasn't the brother Edward, it was the brother Walter, who is Clive's father. And here is a family photograph of building the dam on Rhodes's farm, Sourdale. That dam building was successful and very financially successful. I mean, we are not talking poor little farmers here at all. And so then they were hired by Cecil John to build what was called the Matopo Dam with 2 Ps. And as you can see, Hulse brothers were advertising for the Rhodes Dam. And here again is a family photograph of building the Matopo's Dam. And you can see no bulldozers, etc. They are digging by hand. I don't know if the dams still exist. Anyway, Clive had an elder brother called Frederick, and his elder brother Frederick went off to Kingswood College in Grahamstown. Fred did very well there, as did some of the other cousins, but Clive lasted only 1 year. And he was then sent off to school in East London at Selborne College. And he joined his cousins Stanley and others, and Stanley we'll hear about as well. Now, all the House cousins and brothers were very sporty. And they were described in the school magazine, published during the war as people were killed, as having been, quote, the sporting mainstays of Selborne. And you can see the House Cup was actually awarded to the boy who was voted the most popular by all other boys. And you can see Stanley was Victor Laudorum for 3 years and his brother Cecil for 2 years. Now, there is a bit of a family sadness here, which I will whisper quietly. Clive failed every exam in JC. And when he got to what was called the Cape University exams, meaning matric, he failed every exam as well. But it really didn't matter if you were a House, because Stanley also failed every exam. And really, who cared? They played sport. Their fathers were friendly with Cecil John Rhodes and everybody else, although Rhodes was dead by this time, and they had the farms to go to. Now, by this time, oh, and here is a picture, just so happens I've got one of Stanley, who also played the violin and the piano very beautifully. And while he was in training in Birmingham and Bromwich during the war, he was playing in concerts all over England. He was a very talented man. Now, Walter House and his brother had a falling out. And so you'll see here, Walter House of Carnarvon informs us, the Diamond Fields Advertiser, that he's starting a cattle ranch in Bechuanaland. And I always thought Bechuanaland, quite honestly, was what is now Botswana. But it actually refers to the Northern Cape around Vryburg at the time. He's going to breed purely beef cattle. The land is apparently excellent for cattle. But when I went looking, I didn't think anything could grow there. Ranching has a great future. And of course, what was important was that he had purchased the entire little herd of Pol Angus from De Beers. This was the progeny of the bull and 3 cows imported by Mr. Rhodes from the famous herd of Lord Londonderry, the most famous strain of the back pol in the world. We hope that fortune will smile upon him. Well, it always did. And here is a black Pol Angus. There are red poles and there are black. I mean, I learn a lot of things in my research. Now, I can tell you, Pol means they are exclusively of one colour, so it's really just an Angus, and there's a choice between a red and a black one. Fortunately, I managed to find a black one on the internet, and I would have just lied and said to you it was red. Okay, but anyway, so off we go, and we now have the new farm up in Bechuanaland, and here is the notice to poachers from Walter. But look at it. I am preserving all game, from a quail to a kudu on the subjoined properties. All trespassers, whether persons or dogs, will be shot or prosecuted according to law. Armadillo Creek, which is his new estate, comprising the farms Netherway, Shepherd's Gift, Glenred, Mayfields, and the Occidental Ranch, consisting of 100 square miles of the second railway grant, bounded by the farms Pola, Vieira, Lenapen, and Gapitia game native reserves. God save King George. And I must tell you, the correspondence I have found in things such as the Diamond Fields Advertiser and the Vryburg Northern News, with which is incorporated the Bechuanaland Gazette, have all the letters exchanged between Walter and local magistrates about the wicked natives and about how these reserves must be cut down because everybody is poaching. Anyway, off they go, and they live in the Northern Cape. And it is reported that Mr. Walter House, now of Armadillo Creek, is starting a condensed milk factory. So this was a family of entrepreneurs, of adventurers, of people who started again, and really who were 1820 settlers and had come with nothing. Walter House's grandfather had been the first one to come. Okay. Now, after leaving school, Clive went off to Bechuanaland to the farm. And all I can find in the newspaper reports is quite a lot of tennis playing, some croquet playing. They didn't seem to join any church, they didn't seem to do good works for anybody, but very soon, having returned from school, Clive went off on a hunting expedition. I might add, Fred had also gone off on a hunting expedition. So I don't know that they farmed with much enthusiasm. Now, this is Clive's hunting expedition. And in the beginning, they followed the railway line. So you'll see this says to Vryburg. So he comes from Vryburg, and the person he went with was Dr. Harry Kirkman. Kirkman had been a doctor in Queenstown. So from Vryburg, they went up and they went to Bulawayo. And they had a lovely time in Bulawayo, and I'll tell you the particular kind of gun he bought and why. Then from Bulawayo, they went this way. And at Livingston Falls, he just was overwhelmed with great love for Cecil John Rhodes. And he writes, and I'll read it to you, how the very thundering of the falls seemed to echo the words Rhodes, Rhodes, Rhodes. But, you know, it's easy to laugh, but. Anyway, then they carried on all along here, and now they get to the Belgian Congo. At the Belgian Congo, they get off at, I think it was here. Now, in those days, there were, well, there still are, a lot of rivers, okay, and people were quite confused as to which were the main Congo or which were just tributaries leading into the Congo, or if this was the beginning of the Nile, okay? But anyway, Clive and Dr. Kirkman spent about 6 months here. And I must tell you something. When I first started researching Clive, I only researched him because he was on my first memorial that I did of 20 boys. And I must tell you, I really hated him. He was so rich, and he was so privileged, and he was so idle, and he was so lazy, and the whole family was so entitled. And then when I found the Freiburg Northern News, and it was quite amazing how I found it, but anyway, I found it. And then I read Clive's articles about the hunting trip, and he laughs at himself, and he mocks himself. And he isn't my favorite soldier, but he has become somebody who I see great depths in. So I really want to say, please buy Clive's writings. No, this is not the ad, the advertisement. It's just, here is a boy who was no good at school, and yet I think he writes quite beautifully. Anyway, so off he goes. And he wrote home, and the Freiburg Northern News published a series of articles by him called Towards Central Africa. And he comes across as somebody with a sense of humor, with a lot of irony, an interest in the world, and a great interest in South Africa's place in the world. And yes, his articles are very racist, very bigoted, very imperialistic. But he was a child of his time, and we must see him as that. I mean, after all, here is King Edward. And Clive was following the example of his elders and betters. And here's Teddy Roosevelt. So why should Clive be any different? As he says in his very first article, here we are, determined to slay those who have done us no harm. You know, he's got a little neck with himself each time, which I rather like. So in Bulawayo, Clive heard tales of hunters who'd been tossed sky high by a wounded buffalo. Then there was somebody who'd been crunched up by a lion. Then there was somebody who'd been toyed underfoot by an elephant. And would you believe it, at the Bulawayo Club, somebody had actually been impaled by a rhino. And worst of all, somebody had been dragged by the hind leg by a man eating croc. So he went straight out and bought a Wesley Richards Express. And he wrote, "It is a weapon that I feel will be a wonderful nerve tonic." Then they go across and they get to Victoria Falls. And he writes, "It seems almost incredible that one great mind could have so much for the dark continent. The interminable rails still pointing north, the vast veldt, the silence of the great wilderness with its unrevealed secrets and great destiny seem to murmur roads." You know, and it's just as I say, and the audience lapped it up, that they increased the number of papers they were selling because everybody was loving this exciting trip. Dr. Harry Kirkman didn't seem to write anything, and he was a much more interesting character. He'd come out to South Africa during the Boer War as a medical practitioner. He went back to England after this trip, and he was in the First World War. And the only reference I can find to all of them together is actually that Clive's younger sister sang at a charitable event that Dr. Kirkman organised. Anyway, they get to the Congo River Basin, and Clive writes, "As a recent schoolboy, I've always feared that we would soon be short of elbow room, that the people were growing too many and the earth too small. But this nightmare haunts me no longer. This vast unpopulated continent can absorb scores of millions." And I must tell you, one of the dreadful things he does is he says, well, why don't we just send Gandhi and all his followers to the Congo? The tsetse fly will soon finish them off. I mean, you know. Anyway, he is determined to get an elephant. He writes, 2 hours later, we were trotting on the spoor of 8 or 10 elephants. We'd gone fully 10 to 12 miles, the broken branches and trees leaving me in a momentary expectancy. Under a tree stood the object of the chase and the goal of my ambition. Of course, the only right thing to do was crawl up and take snaps. But I was too eager, and I aimed at the heart and fired my 500 Express. To my unutterable delight, the mighty monster paused and sank to the earth. And what did he do? He says, I threw my hat into the air and gave 3 cheers for George V. And here is George V on his hunting expedition. He shot tigers and a great big black bear. But Clive now had a problem. He says, I was faced with the problem of what shall I do with the tusks? Out of the question to drag it to our campus, it weighed easily 10 tons. With qualms of conscience, he says, I took several photographs, 1 foot, 1 ear, his tail, part of his trunk, his ivory, and his measurements. His tusk, 5 feet in length, weighing about 90 pounds, will, when export duty of 2 shillings and 6pence per pound, make a nice fender. Anyway, when he returned home, war was declared. And Clive, with nothing better to do, joined Cullinan's horse. And I can't see, oh, there's Cullinan's horse. And he was a trooper in Cullinan's horse and saw a very short period of service in German Southwest Africa because he got onto a ship and he sailed for England because he wanted to join the Flying Corps. And here is the photograph as somebody sent it to me, and I just wanted to show you. He's born 18th November 1892 in Queenstown, South Africa. He's a second-class air mechanic at that stage. This is 22nd of October 1915, and he's grown a moustache. Okay? And that's the first picture I've got of Clive. I haven't got anything of him at school. Now, the Royal Flying Corps were very glamorous. Everybody wanted to join the RFC because in this incredibly boring, anonymous war of people in the mud of the trenches, these were individual heroes. They were skilled people. And so it was very difficult to get into the Flying Corps, and they were seen as very glamorous. So William Orpen painted quite a lot of Flying Corps pictures. Here is a postcard, and this is the RFC motto, per ardua ad astra. Clive applied, and you can see here he is, and he claims to have been in Cullinan's horse, and off he goes, aged 22 years, to join the RFC. They're very interested in the medical history because they're interested in his eyes. Everybody else, they're interested in chest measurements, but here it's how his eyes are. Anyway, he is sent off to the airfield camp at Netheravon, which is still in use today. While he was at Netheravon, he was injured. And the injury was that Jan Smuts's nephew on Izzy's side was also in the flying school, and Clive was turning his propeller, and it turned and turned, and it broke Clive's arm. And so he was delayed, and he was a little late in his graduation. So off he went to the military hospital at Fargo. Anyway, then he was at Bromwich Flight School, which is here, and then at Oxford, where the flyers were lectured. Now, you're firstly a mechanic, and then you are a cadet, and then you become a flyer. So here he is learning about engines, and he writes articles on the wing, also published in the Freiburg Northern News. And you can see that the letters are meant to provide a lot of information to local newspapers interested in this very modern development, and people ask a lot of questions, and he responds to them. He writes, for instance, about the Avro aeroplane. Above the average in accidents have occurred. 2 pilots should have been killed but were destined for something better. They were flying Avros, a fast 2-seater with a closed-in body. The first happened at noon yesterday. He landed too steep, did not put his head down soon enough, and consequently stood gracefully on his head with his whole nose and engine crushed in. He writes about their work on aeroplane machines. There's no end of hard work still before us. We must have an intimate knowledge of every detail of flying machines. We must be able to fly 3 or 4 types of aeroplanes and be able to use wireless and other signals, beside having to pass severe tests in military matters and formations. And indeed, there was a lot of training. This is how not to land. Okay? This is quite interesting. This is how to fly, and it says through your own or your enemy's barrage, because you are going to be hit. And we'll see in Clive's flying career how that had to be avoided, or how to land in the mist. Okay? He writes, new types of machine are being constantly received and tested. He says, lately we've been working on the Morris Farman, Longhorn and Shorthorn. Then there's the Avro. Finally, we're working on the Martinside Scout single-seater, a perfect greyhound of the air with a normal speed of 85 miles per hour. He says, downwind in speed, it resembles a darting blue sparrowhawk, what we call a Cape Lanner. He says, we are not in the confidence of the military, but feel and realize an air of tenseness. Big things are on the carpet. England is awake in the vital consequences of this awful struggle. We are champing at the bit and only slowly realizing that learning to fly may not be a matter of weeks only, but an intimate mechanical knowledge of every detail of your vehicle, which means months of slogging. And then as Air Scouts, we must be able to transmit accurate pictures to the earth of what we see from above, so the responsibility of the Scout weighs heavily on us. They go off to church at this particular church in Bromwich, and he says church parades are fine. We march about 1.5 miles up Bromwich Hill to an old church with good chimes, organ and choir. And then he says, the RFC is a much looked up to corps. In the demonstration, our lorries were met with cheers. The lower classes thinks every man is connected with the RFC as a flyer. As an instance, when we were out walking the other day, a couple of little urchins said, hey Bill, there's one of them blokes, what drops bombs on them German Zeppelins. And you can see it's the grandness and the fun of it that is important. He says about being at Netheravon, as I think I previously observed, the King's English is treated crudely here. Last night in orders for Sunday, the non-com read out, Roman Catholics will parade at 10 a.m., other donations at 10:30. He writes, the cockpit, and this is the cockpit of a Sopwith Strutter, the kind he was in. The pilot and observer are always strapped down in well-upholstered aluminium seats. In most machines, the pilot sits behind the observer. Yes, there is a speaking arrangement, but the roar of the engine forbids conversation. Your feet only work the rudders. With one hand, you can manipulate the rest. That is, to ascend and descend. He says the machines are fitted out with all necessary instruments, such as revolution, altitude, and speed gauges. The latter are worked by the pressure of the draft you are making. He says the observer is the passenger, the pilot the chauffeur, but as often as not, he is captain and crew. Every day they're trying to turn out more pilot observers to lessen weight. And here's an observer with another kind of camera. It's called a Hythe gun camera. He writes, no parachutes are kept in stock. Picture the sporting target you would offer while majestically dropping behind the German lines. He writes about the wonderful motorbike that he and Stanley have and how they're used to drive all over. He says the swimming pool in Bromwich is their very great treat. He talks about their cricket matches and Stanley playing the piano. Then he writes, what great problems are before us for reflection? Do we all realize what the aftermath of this revolutionary world war will be? Is there a seer bold enough to tell us what the social and constitutional conditions of Europe 2 years hence will be? Since the days of Adam, world matters have never been so interesting as today. If Germany has to be beaten by the process of attrition caused by our nibbling methods, then years may pass and the end be not yet. Surely it seems more reasonable that economic causes may cause this conflict. The enemy is in a state of close siege. Our battleships, like clenched fists, are keeping her at home, and surely long before she runs out of men, she will run short of food or other indispensable necessaries. After the war, he says, will there be world depression or prosperity? Expenditure has been so abnormal that things cannot possibly remain normal. Will the nation survive the stupendous financial strain? Surely when Germany's peace currency is presented for payment, she must become hopelessly bankrupt. Is the labourer in England going to settle down without a murmur to his present wage? How is the young manhood of our empire going to be influenced? Speaking for myself, will I, as one of thousands, be able to return to my farming occupation in the wilds of Bechuanaland? It will require all one's backbone and grit, and what of a world depleted of the flower of its manhood? And as he writes this, I begin to think that Clive had started thinking of himself as somebody with a political career. Anyway, in Christmas 1916, he was at Denham, and then the great day came and he was awarded his wings. And in the London Gazette of the 23rd of February 1917, temporary second lieutenant on probation C.H. House, General List, was gazetted as a second lieutenant. So he is now a very smart officer. It's what he has wanted. And here is a painting by Sir William Orpen. Now, Clive was commissioned in February just as what is known as Bloody April was beginning. We have here Paris, Brussels, the Channel. Clive, like everybody else, would have arrived at Le Havre, and basically the front line is like that, and the British had a great advance at Arras. So it is this great advance, the Battle of Arras, April 1917, that is Bloody April. Here are the trenches at Arras. Here is Arras Cemetery, here are the trenches and the German lines. And the attack was planned over the Easter weekend. Now, this is Brigadier General Trenchard. He was in charge of all RFC operations in France. He was informed that pilots of the 70th Squadron, to which Clive was sent, were worn out and could fly no more. And he wrote this: "We are fighting a very big battle, and the fighting in the air is becoming intense and will increase, I regret to say, and not decrease. It is only a question of our keeping it going longer than the Huns. If we cannot do that, we are beaten. If we do it, then we win. I must warn you that in the next 10 days, if we get fine weather, I anticipate a very heavy casualty list. There are many more German machines, fast and much better fighters, which had suddenly appeared on our front opposite to us than have been here before." So the observation plane, which Clive was to fly, went off above the lines. The Battle of Vimy happened, and this is the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where the Canadians scored the only success in this Easter campaign. And Clive was sent off to the 70th Squadron. I haven't been able to find a badge for the 70th Squadron as Royal Flying Corps. This is obviously a couple of years later when it became the Royal Air Force. And they were sent to a place called Villiers here. Now, it's got a calvary at the beginning, the little village, a church, and a lot of barns in the front with the farmhouses behind. The first one was a brick one. Here is a wattle and daub one. Here is another brick one with wattle and daub behind. Here we've got a stone barn. Here we've got a wattle and daub one. Here is the little street and a wooden barn. And as I wandered around taking my photographs, everybody came out to look. Now, they've also got some quite grand houses, and that's rather nice if you're an airman. You don't want to stay in a crummy little place. So there's some rather nice houses that you can stay in and be comfortable while you are flying from this area. You can see it's an old area. Now, the farming around here is potatoes and Swedes, okay? And as you can see, it is flat, 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 perfect for flying. So this is where they were flying. And Clive was allocated to a 1.5 Sopwith Strutter. Now, on the particular day, they went off on a reconnaissance. This is Clive's very first flight in France. And they go off, and they are going south of Cambrai. So what they do is they take off and they fly around, well, not that big, but they fly around until they get to 10,000 feet. They can't be too low because the artillery will hit them. And then they fly over to do their reconnaissance. They do what is called a dawn patrol. They go at 5:30 in the morning, before the smoke, before the haze, before it becomes quite difficult to photograph and to see. What are they looking for? They're looking for new trenches, they're looking for artillery that's moved up, they're looking for growth in the number of troops in an area. And here you can see this, they're over here, there is the British front line, okay? That is the Hindenburg line, which is now the German line, and that will become significant. It is the Canal du Nord. Now, just south of the Canal du Nord is a big abbey, the Abbey de Vaucelles. So Clive and Airman William James Bond get into their Sopwith strata. And the report by Captain Tedder, who was later Chief of Air Staff, but who at this stage was CO of 70 Squadron, writes that there were, and he writes the date, the 24th of April, they are at 10,000 feet, and then he's got, I'm sorry it's such a bad picture, the number of planes, and they met up with Albatross scouts. And the actual report says, while the formation was flying southeast of Cambrai, a formation of 6 Albatross scouts attacked from the direction of the sun. Lieutenant Hulse and 2nd Airman Bond were apparently hit early in the engagement, and whilst gliding down under the formation, they were attacked and shot down by the Albatross. So here they are, and they have been shot down. So they're somewhere here. Okay. Sorry. This is the yasta of the Albatross. And this is a particular Albatross, and this is called Yasta Bulker-Burney. It's named after their CO, who is a man called Fritz Otto Burney. He was in charge. This is him here, and it is he who shot down Clive. He was a year younger than Clive. He'd been in the infantry, but he was wounded 4 times. And the last time with a bayonet, which severed the main nerve in his left arm. With his arm useless, he joined the air service. He flew for a year as an observer before he underwent pilot training. Unusually for an airman, he actually wore glasses. He was posted to Yasta 2. He'd received the Iron Cross, both first and second class, as well as the Knight's Cross and various other orders. And the day before he shot down Clive, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite. This is, as I say, his yasta. And on the day of shooting down Clive, he was credited with 5 victories. That is, 5 planes shot down. Here is Lieutenant Burney, and here this plane is his own particular plane, and Otto Burney died in the flu epidemic in October 1918. So with this having happened on Clive's first flight in France, a telegram is sent to his father Walter. Care of the Standard Bank of South Africa, regret to inform you 2nd Lieutenant Hulse missing. This does not necessarily mean killed or wounded. Now, Walter was in South Africa, didn't receive the telegram, but his mother, Letty, who was in England, did. There was no news, so his older brother, Fred, who was serving with the Cambridgeshire Regiment, wrote a very angry letter and got into big trouble for writing a letter. Then Walter wrote, and you can see there's now a black-bordered letter, and he writes, "My wife, I have just returned from South Africa, has had no advice from the War Office since your telegram dated the 27th ult, advising us that 2nd Lieutenant C.H. Hull 70 Squadron was reported missing, not necessarily killed or wounded. His poor mother has naturally been in a proper frenzy of anxiety ever since, and it seems to her very strange that no subsequent information has since been received. Surely later it must have been received, and all the suffering of a mother spared her. We would like every available detail of information." And then there's a PS at the end. "General Smuts is a personal friend, and through his kindness / helpfulness, I may be able to go across. In the meantime, awaiting your advice." Now, there were many letters backwards and forwards. Clive's name was included on a list of missing airmen, and the list was sent to the Netherlands and circulated to all hospitals and internment camps in Germany. Then Clive's father, Walter, wrote about his son's kit and propeller walking stick, and it turned out that messages had been dropped over the lines, but no news. Then there was a letter saying, Second Lieutenant Seward, who was flying alongside Second Lieutenant Hulse, states, I saw this officer's machine come down in flames. And in view of this report and of the lapse of time, he has now been accepted for official purposes as having, or death has now been accepted as having occurred in action. So a death certificate was issued. Clive's will, where he'd left everything to his mother, was acted upon, and his estate was administered. There was an insurance policy and not much else. Fred had actually been given quite a lot of farms already, but not Clive. And there were obituaries in the Northern News, Kingswood Magazine, Selborne College Magazine. And that would normally be the end, and Clive's name would be on this memorial. It is the memorial to the missing airmen of the First World War. And in fact, one of the times I went there, I discovered that my grandmother's cousin, who'd been a Rhodes Scholar, had joined up, and he was a missing airman. Anyway, the rest of the family were now getting ready to go back to South Africa. The war is now getting over. Constance, his sister, is over here. She had joined up in 1915. She nursed at the Connaught Hospital in Aldershot. And in fact, it was from there that she wrote in June 1916, we are not too busy here at present, but we expect a big rush quite soon. And although we have 1,000 beds, we're having marquees put up for the overflow. She wrote, England is very beautiful, but it has a wicked climate. I'd give much for a gallop across the Bechuanaland veldt. And this is where the hospitals were in the main. Her hospital was there. And this is the only photograph. Remember, the hospitals no longer really exist. So this is the area where the hospitals were. And in fact, here there were 11 general hospitals, 1 stationary hospital, 4 Red Cross hospitals, and a convalescent hospital. At any one time, they could deal with 22,000 patients. Now, the patients, some of them still remain. This is the cemetery which serviced the hospitals, Etapel Cemetery. Buried in it are over 10,000 graves of soldiers who died in the hospitals. There are dead nurses and there are dead women workers. There are also German patients, and you can see they have a different kind of stone. Brother Fred was gassed, but he came back to South Africa. Sister Molly, or Maud, trained at the Royal Academy of Music, and she came back to South Africa, and here Constance and Molly are. And Stanley, I'm just going to ignore, but that is Stanley in training, and this is him flying, and he writes about everything. So now, Clive's name is not on the memorial to the missing. Why? Because we have a report. Lieutenant C.H. House, General List, missing 24 April 1917, death accepted as having occurred in action because of the statement by Lieutenant Seward. And then the following is an extract from the 16th report of the Dame Livingston mission. Commune of Bantuzelle. In the military cemetery near the Calvary, 3 single graves. English aviator Hulse, Dryburgh, South Africa, died 24/4/1917. Now, Adelaide Livingston was an American. She married a Brit. She worked for the Quakers. And she worked in occupied Belgium and Germany and Austria during the war. She was a delegate of the British government to talk about the treatment with the Germans of British POWs. She was made a Dame of the British Empire in 1918. And then she was sent on a War Office mission to go hunting for the missing in France and Flanders. And she was an assistant director of graves registration. And her report had this information. So a letter was sent off to Walter that now we regret, but Clive has been found. So Clive set off from Fine-Villiers. South of Cambrai he went down, and here, just south, is Bantuzelle. And it's near the Canal du Nord. Here is the canal. Here's a rather grand house in this sort of one-street town. Here is the Calvary, to which Dame Livingston made mention. Here is the ordinary cemetery for the French people of Bantuzel. Here are 3 little graves. They are graves from 1914, when the British were chased back by the Germans. One of them is a Fusilier, and one is a Lancashire Fusilier, and 2 are Royal Irish Fusiliers. And they are in the French communal cemetery, and they were left there. It's not a military cemetery, and the French didn't need, and the French don't actually move British graves from their commune cemetery. Here is the large grassed area next to the Calvary. And this must have been, during the time of German occupation, a German military cemetery. Clive would have come down